Man, Michael Nunn. And
Man,
you made it so easy.
No, it wasn't easy like that.
James Toney never met a fight he wouldn't take or an enemy he wouldn't make. They called him Lights Out for a reason, but it wasn't just his devastating left hook that left opponents seeing stars. It was his mouth, his attitude, and his absolute refusal to back down from anyone, anywhere, anytime.
No, his feet are so open. I knew it.
Throughout his legendary career, Toney didn't just collect titles, he collected enemies. Behind the gloves and the glory, boxing's most controversial champion waged wars that went far beyond the ropes.
Which was your hardest fight?
Myself. With myself. Good. I was so good.
We're talking about grudges that lasted decades, feuds that split gyms apart, and rivalries so bitter they made the actual fights look like friendly sparring sessions. From alleged betrayals by former sparring partners to explosive confrontations with pound-for-pound legends, Toney's career was built on more than just skill. It was fueled by pure, unfiltered hatred. These weren't just professional disagreements about who deserved the next title shot. These were personal vendettas that consumed fighters.
And he's just saying, go ahead and hit me. And ironically, Tony's having a hard time doing it. I know, which is truly amazing. Not now, though.
Destroyed friendships, and created some of the most intense moments in boxing history. Today, we're counting down the 6 boxers that James Toney despised the most. Trust me, the drama you're about to hear will shock you. This is boxing's dark side, raw, unfiltered, and absolutely explosive. 6. Iran Barkley. Coming in at number 6 is a rivalry that most boxing fans have never heard about, but insiders swear it was real. Iran the Blade Barkley, the Bronx brawler who allegedly turned Toney's own training camp into a war zone. Here's what supposedly went down behind closed doors. Barkley and Toney were sparring partners in the late 80s, grinding it out in Detroit's toughest gyms. But according to sources close to the situation, these weren't friendly tune-up sessions. They were bloody battles that had trainers scrambling to separate them.
This is a job for a rookie. You should pull this guy up and say, you're not later on. That's right, those body punches.
Barkley, already a seasoned professional with knockout power, allegedly took liberties with the younger Toney during sparring, targeting his body with vicious shots that crossed the line between preparation and punishment. The breaking point supposedly came during a particularly heated session when Barkley allegedly told Toney he was too slick for his own good, and that his defensive style was pretty boy boxing. Toney, never one to back down from verbal warfare, reportedly fired back that Barkley was a one-dimensional puncher who'd never outbox anyone with real skill. What made this feud particularly bitter was the professional jealousy element. Barkley was struggling to maintain his status as a middleweight contender, while Toney was already being hailed as the next big thing. Training camp sources claimed Toney would purposely embarrass Barkley during sparring sessions, making him look foolish with his slick defensive movement. The animosity allegedly lasted years, with both fighters taking subtle shots at each other in interviews whenever the other's name came up. 5. Evander Holyfield. Coming in at number 5 is a rivalry that boxing politics kept from ever reaching its full potential. Evander the Real Deal Holyfield, the cruiserweight king who allegedly dismissed Toney as nothing more than a blown-up middleweight with delusions of heavyweight grandeur. Here's what supposedly went down behind the scenes. Throughout the mid-90s, Toney was desperately trying to establish himself as a legitimate heavyweight contender, while Holyfield was already the division's established champion. But according to sources close to both camps, Holyfield never took Toney seriously as a heavyweight threat. The disrespect allegedly started during a chance encounter at a Las Vegas casino, where Holyfield reportedly told Toney he was too small to hang with the big boys and should stick to fighting middleweights. Toney, never one to tolerate being dismissed, allegedly fired back that Holyfield was an overrated bum who got lucky against old men like Foreman, and that he'd knock his holy head clean off his shoulders. The verbal warfare escalated when Holyfield's trainer allegedly leaked to the press that they considered Toney a novelty act rather than a serious contender. What made this feud particularly frustrating was the missed opportunity element. Toney genuinely believed he could expose Holyfield's vulnerabilities, especially after watching him struggle against lesser competition. Training camp insiders claim Toney would study Holyfield's fights obsessively, pointing out flaws and weaknesses to anyone who'd listen. The animosity allegedly intensified when promotional politics and weight class politics prevented their clash from ever materializing, leaving both fighters with lingering resentment that lasted well into their retirement years. 4. Bernard Hopkins. Coming in at number 4 is a rivalry that split the entire boxing world down the middle. Bernard, the Executioner, Hopkins, the Philadelphia prison graduate who allegedly turned their potential super fight into a decade-long war of words that got more personal than any actual punch ever thrown. Here's what supposedly went down behind the scenes. Throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, both fighters were dominating their respective weight classes, with fans and media constantly debating who was the superior defensive mastermind. But according to sources close to both camps, Hopkins never respected Toney's accomplishments, allegedly calling him a fat, lazy talent waster who relied on natural ability instead of discipline and hard work. The breaking point supposedly came during a backstage encounter at a HBO event when Hopkins allegedly told Toney he was everything wrong with boxing and that his weight fluctuations proved he didn't respect the sport. Toney, never one to tolerate criticism about his conditioning, reportedly fired back that Hopkins was a boring fighter who put people to sleep and that he'd school him like the convict he used to be. What made this feud particularly intense was the contrast in their approaches. Hopkins represented discipline and longevity, while Toney embodied raw talent and natural ability. Training camp sources claim both fighters would obsessively study each other's techniques, with Hopkins allegedly telling sparring partners that Toney's style was sloppy, and Toney reportedly calling Hopkins' defense robotic. The animosity allegedly reached its peak when contract negotiations fell apart multiple times, with both sides blaming the other for the super fight that never happened, leaving fans forever wondering what could have been. 3. Roy Jones Jr. Coming in at number 3 is the rivalry that actually made it to the ring. Roy Superman Jones Jr., the pound-for-pound king who allegedly turned their legendary showdown into a personal vendetta that lasted far beyond the final bell. Here's what supposedly went down behind the scenes. Leading up to their 1994 super middleweight unification bout, Jones was being hailed as boxing's next great superstar, while Toney was viewed as the crafty veteran standing in his way. But according to sources close to both camps, Jones never gave Toney the respect he deserved, allegedly telling reporters that Toney was past his prime and that his speed would make the Detroit native look like he was fighting in slow motion. The breaking point supposedly came during the pre-fight press conference when Jones allegedly dismissed Toney's questions about his amateur background, saying, "That amateur stuff don't mean nothing when you're dealing with real professionals." Toney, never one to tolerate being talked down to, reportedly fired back that Jones was all hype and no heart, and that he'd expose him as a front-runner when the going gets tough. What made this feud particularly bitter was the controversial decision aftermath. Many observers, including seasoned boxing writers, believed Toney had done enough to win their classic encounter. Training camp sources claim Toney was obsessed with getting a rematch, allegedly telling anyone who'd listened that Jones knew he lost that fight and was ducking him like the plague. The animosity allegedly intensified when Jones moved up to light heavyweight instead of giving Toney the immediate rematch he desperately wanted, leaving both fighters with unfinished business that haunted their careers. 2. Mike McCallum. Coming in at number 2 is the rivalry that nearly destroyed both men's careers before it even began. Mike, the body snatcher McCallum, the Jamaican assassin whose alleged betrayal during contract negotiations turned their anticipated super fight into a bitter feud that consumed the entire middleweight division. Here's what supposedly went down behind the scenes. Throughout the early 90s, both fighters were being positioned as the premier middleweights of their era, with boxing insiders salivating over a potential unification bout. But according to sources close to both camps, McCallum's team allegedly used inside information from joint promotional meetings to sabotage Toney's negotiating position, deliberately leaking details about Toney's demands to the media to make him look greedy and difficult. The breaking point supposedly came during a heated phone call between the fighters, when McCallum allegedly told Toney he was nothing but a loudmouth American who didn't deserve to share the ring with real champions. Toney, never one to tolerate international disrespect, reportedly fired back that McCallum was a boring foreign fighter who put crowds to sleep, and that he'd send him back to Jamaica in a body bag. What made this feud particularly venomous was the cultural and stylistic clash. McCallum represented old-school Caribbean boxing discipline, while Toney embodied American swagger and natural talent. Training camp sources claim both fighters would study each other's fights obsessively, with McCallum allegedly telling sparring partners that Toney's defense had holes big enough to drive a truck through, and Toney reportedly calling McCallum's style predictable and prehistoric. The animosity allegedly reached its peak when promotional politics prevented their clash from ever materializing, with both sides blaming the other for the super fight that boxing fans never got to witness, leaving a permanent stain on both their legacies. Number 1. Michael Nunn. Number 1 is the most personal and devastating rivalry of Toney's entire career. Michael second to none, the former sparring partner whose alleged betrayal turned their friendship into a blood feud that ended with one of boxing's most brutal knockouts. Here's what supposedly went down behind the scenes. Back in the late 80s, Nunn and Toney were inseparable training partners, grinding it out in Detroit's grittiest gyms under the same trainers. But according to sources close to both fighters, everything changed when Nunn allegedly promised to help Toney get his first major title shot, only to secretly negotiate his own deal behind Toney's back, cutting his former friend completely out of the picture. The breaking point supposedly came when Toney discovered Nunn had been feeding information about his training habits and weaknesses to opposing camps. During a confrontational phone call, Nunn allegedly told Toney he was too dumb to handle business, and that he'd always be second-rate compared to real champions. Toney, feeling completely betrayed by someone he considered a brother, reportedly fired back that Nunn was a backstabbing snake who'd pay for his betrayal in blood. What made this feud particularly devastating was the personal element. These weren't just professional rivals, they were former friends who knew each other's secrets, weaknesses, and fears. Training camp sources claim Toney became obsessed with getting revenge, allegedly telling anyone who'd listened that Nunn had sold his soul for a title shot, and that he'd make him pay for every lie he told. When they finally met in the ring in 1991, Toney's vicious 11th round knockout wasn't just a victory. It was personal vengeance served cold, ending their friendship forever with one devastating left hook. James Toney's legacy wasn't just built on victories. It was forged in the fires of rivalry and revenge. These feuds shaped boxing history and proved that sometimes the most explosive action happened outside the ring. Which rivalry do you think was the most intense? Smash that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more boxing's untold stories.